Hello, I'm Jeremy. Today I'm going to be taking a look at a game by the name of Samarkand, designed by the late, great Sid Sackson, one of the first early designers of games that would now be called Euro games. This was initially published, I believe, in like 1980 or something like that, and my version is from about 1998. I believe it's currently out of print, so if you want to get this game, you'll have to track down a used copy. It was published in the USA by Rio Grande Games, although there are international editions as well. The game does not have any language requirements on its components, so finding an import copy would work well. And this isn't, I suppose, almost an economic game where players are going to be trying to collect sets of like goods to turn them in for money. It's essentially a race to get 500 money, and then the player who does that, quickest will win. But there are some real tight constraints on the game in terms of what your options are on your turn. So let me take a few minutes to show you how the game works, then I'll come back, let you know what I think about the game. Samarkand is a trading game where your goal is to take your initial $200 and become the first player to turn that into $500. And you're going to be doing that by turning in sets of these various goods cards. So there are several different types of these. And each player is going to get a little index card that shows them how valuable those goods are, and they're on here from least to most valuable. So generally what you're going to be doing is moving your little pawn around the board following these arrows, and then moving to these city spaces. When you go to the city spaces, you can see that they have certain icons on those spaces. So this city will accept bundles of wheat or bundles of lamps, whereas this city here, it would accept bundles of camels, or it has this arch symbol, which I'll note is on that card there, which means bundles of different goods. So you can see here that the goods have various amounts that they're worth. And you can see, like, for example, a set of 2 wheat is worth 10, but you could turn in a set of 7 wheat for 140, whereas the diamonds, a set of only 6 of those is worth 200. There's no ability to turn in a set of anything of 7, but the wheat, that's the only one you have. This last thing, this arch symbol here, this indicates what happens if you turn in a set of unique goods. So for example, if you turn in one of each of the 6 type of goods, that would be worth $100. So that's not especially profitable. You generally want to turn in like goods to do that. So each player, like I said, is going to get $200 at the start of the game. They'll get 7 good cards just at random, and then they'll be able to place their pawn on any starting space. So multiple people could go on the same space. The game plays from 2 to 5 players. If you have fewer than 5 players, you'll remove some goods at random, or a certain number of each type of good from the deck. So like I said, each player will get 200, and then what you'll do is you'll put 2 cards on each of these spaces. So you can see these spaces have a number on them, 4, 5, or 6. That's how many good cards they'll be able to hold. And each one of these has, you might be able to see it here, an arrow that points to one of these nomad trading areas. So this set of cards corresponds with this set of cards corresponds with this, and so on. So 2 of those will go on each of those spaces at random. So on your turn, what you're going to be doing is essentially moving your pawn, and there are several ways that you can move the pawn, and then essentially going to one of these spaces on the board. There's 3 different types of spaces, and executing the action of that space. So first I'll explain movement. So the way that movement works is there are 2 options. The first is that you pay $5, remembering that money is essentially victory points, to roll this die, and you have to move and execute the space where you roll. So this is a 5-sided die. It has 1 through 5, and then the 6th side is a move backward space. So like that. So if this player rolled the die, they would get a 3, and you could only move as the arrow. So they would go 1, 2, and that's mandatory because these arrows are only one way. Then you can see here they could either go to this space or this space, because there's an arrow pointing out this way, an arrow pointing up this way, so maybe they would go here, then they would execute that space. So that's one option, pay $5 to roll the die. The other option is essentially to move one space and then execute the action of that space. So this is free to do. So for example, this player can move here and then do the action associated with this space. One exception to this is, let's say this player was here. If you move into one of these yellow spaces, which is a nomad camp, then you have the option to just move on as long as you haven't rolled a die. one more space. So you could move here, choose not to do this, just move on one space, and then choose to move on one space, so you go either here or here. Let's say you go here, then you have to stop and do the action of this space because it's not one of these yellow spaces. So it's one movement for free, potentially getting bonus movements if you want to, skip the space that you've moved on to, and then you would just stop and do the action. So there are three types of action spaces. You can see there are cities, there are nomad spaces, and then there are oases. So each of these has a different function. First of all, the oases, they'll have on them printed two values. So for example, and this essentially lets you draw cards at random from the deck, add them to your hand. So here you could draw one card for 5 money or 4 cards for 25 money. Whereas down here, for example, one card is 5 money, but 4 cards is only 20 money. Here, 4 cards is 30 money. So each of these essentially just lets you pay money to draw cards. You could, and it's mandatory to do that, and you have to do either the 1 or the 4. You can't mix and match or do both or do it multiple times. So that is how the oases work. You just get random cards from the deck. The second option are these bandit camps, so are these nomad camps. So if this red player, for example, moved here, what they would have to do is, you can see that this area here has room for up to 5 cards. They would essentially have to trade with the nomads. So they would have to give up one card from their hand. It could be any card. So maybe they would give up this wheat, since that's not especially valuable. And then once they've done that, they could trade any number of cards from their hand with cards already there. So this player has, some of these carpets. So maybe they would want to trade another wheat for a carpet, and then maybe one of these camels for a lamp to work on a set of lamps. So you could do that any number of times once you pay the initial card to initiate trading. It's just an offering, I guess, thematically. If you do not have a card, I believe you have to pay 20 money to buy the first card from the top of the deck and essentially give that one up. Now, like I said, there is a limit to how many cards can be held here. So let's say this player had moved on to this space and there were 5 cards already there. If that's the case, then the player has to pay 10 money into the bank. Then they get to take all of those cards there. So over the course of the rounds, every time a player goes there, 1 card will get added. And once it's filled up, then essentially a player could go there and swoop all those cards up for a really cheap price. Once a player does that, 2 cards at random will come back out. The third thing that you can do is to go to one of these cities, and then when you go there, you have to initiate a sale. So, like, for example, here, this one, like I said, it accepts either wheat or lamps, and you then have to turn in one of those sets. So you could see a set is at least 2 cards. You could do up to 7 cards of the wheat or up to 6 cards of the other types. So it's mandatory to do this. If you cannot do this, you're going to have to pay a penalty. You just have to show your hand to the other players to prove that you can't make a trade, and you have to pay $20 into the bank. So you only want to go to these cities when you're going to be able to make a trade. So this player would not be able to do they could actually do these 2 wheat or these 2 lamps, and they could trade as much as they have from their hand that they want to, but it'll just be one trade. So, for example, they would sell these 2 wheat back, and you could see 2 wheat would be worth 10 money. They would just get 10 money back from the bank. That would end their turn. What you would also do, there are these 2 transparent chips that come with the game. After you make a sale of a good, you essentially put one of those chips on it. Then the second one will go on the second thing that's sold. So then, let's say another player comes and makes a sale of lanterns. They'll get to pick one of these 2 chips to move on to that space. Whenever you sell a good of the chip, or of the type that the chip is covering, so for example, if I go here and I sold lanterns, I essentially get 1 fewer. If I turn it in a set of 4, for example, I only get the rate for turning in a set of 3. So you trade at a lower rate for that, and that's to, I guess, simulate a market, being flooded with goods of a given type. So essentially, those are your 3 options: to move to a space and sell a set of goods, to move to a nomad group and give an offering and do a trade, or take a full set of cards for 10 money, or to move to one of these oases and then to buy either 1 or 4 cards. And players will just keep taking turns doing one of those actions until one of the players reaches $500. At that point, the player that has $500 will win. One thing I'll mention is that there is an expansion for this game. This is, I guess, really more of a variant. It's called Isfahan, and I created just a print-and-play version of this. And what this does is it just changes the way these markets work. So you don't use these yellow chips to reduce the cost of markets, but what you do is you essentially put 2 of these little markers in each city at the start of the game, which will determine the goods that they're accepted. So you ignore the types that are on the board. So for example, if this player comes here and sells grapes, what will happen then is this X will come in, and then the grapes will go where the X was. And now this city's only accepting one type of goods. So over the course of the game, that would change which cities are accepting which goods. So it does have more potential for you to get, cut off. Essentially, you're making your way over to this city to sell grapes, and somebody goes there, sells grapes first, and now all of a sudden they're not selling grapes. So that's a little bit more chaotic, but it does avoid the issue where the prices go down on the cards that you're selling. So just another variant for a game that is at its core pretty simple, and that is Samarkand. Okay, so that is Samarkand, and I think that this is a game that, from the rules explanation, you don't really get a sense of what makes it interesting to play. On its face, it looks like you have very few decisions. It looks like you're just going to be randomly drawing cards. You're going to be forced to just move one space most of your turns and do whatever the space that you land on says. And to a certain degree, that is true, but a lot of the strategies in the game are surround mitigating that and thinking about how you could optimize that situation. For example, there are turns where the smart move is to take your chance and roll that die and maybe hope that you get 5 so you can motor around the board more quickly to get to the space where you need to go to sell the goods that you have. Or another consideration is what you're leaving behind when you're going to go to one of those trading spots, those nomad spots. If you know that other players are collecting wheat, you may not want to leave a wheat card in a trading area for another player to come and get it, or if, a lot of players leave the same type of goods, that becomes halfway, to completing a full set of those cards. Something I don't think I mentioned in my rules explanation is that as the deck runs out in this game, which will happen several times during the course of the game, probably 2 or 3 times, once that happens, players are going to have to discard down, I believe, to 12 cards, and because of that, players cannot just keep hoarding cards until they get full sets and then turn in a full set every time. Because a full set is 6 or 7 cards depending on the type of goods that you're turning in. You can only really work on 1 or 2 sets at a time if you're going to be wary of that hand limit kicking in when the deck runs out. So being afraid of that, making suboptimal moves because of that fear that you're going to just have to discard cards is a very real part of the game. So on its face, like I said, this doesn't seem to be a complex game. It's definitely not a complex game, but it is one that I think warrants being played 40 years, almost 40 years after it's come out. Like I said, it's not in print. It is a game that you can relatively easily track down a copy of, and I think it is worth doing. There are those 2 variants I showed at the end of the video, the Isfahan variant for this game. I generally prefer to play actually with the basic rules, just because it's a little bit frustrating for you to be moving toward a city space to sell a particular type of good, to have another player go there and essentially move its icon to another space across the board. That's a strategic consideration. I guess it depends what type of game you're going to play with it. If you want something a little bit more chaotic or something that is more about planning, the penalty is a little bit less severe. You just essentially sell back at a rate of 1 less if you play with the base rules. But either one of those variants is interesting, and I think the game works well either way. And like I said, I just did a mock-up of the expansion because it's virtually impossible to find at this point, I would think, because the game itself is out of print for over a decade now. I don't know that there's been any international version of it that's more recent than this 1998 version that I have, which is, like I said, it's published in the U.S. by Rio Grande Games. There is an Abacus Spiel version of it, no language dependence on it. So for this is a very early Euro game, as far as what we would call a Euro game nowadays. Like I said, originally I think released in 1980, and it's one that I think still does hold up. If you're looking for a lighter trading game, this would be one that I think still warrants play today. So those are my thoughts on Samarkand, and thank you for watching.